Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Happy New Year, one and all. Along with Jim Geraghty of National Review, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have, really bad and crazy martinis for conservatives today. We hope all of you enjoyed all of our 6 installments of our Three Martini Lunch awards. And to the winners, we hope that you enjoyed getting the award. Most of you probably did. Some of you probably not. But anyway, always great fun. Hope you had a lot of fun with your family and friends over the holidays. And some of you perhaps are still on vacation, but we appreciate you checking us out as we get back to our daily podcast here. Jim, today is the last day of the unified Republican majority in Congress, because tomorrow we get a Democratic House with Speaker Nancy Pelosi, but we also get a Senate with a slightly larger Republican majority. It also means that people like Jeff Flake are leaving the Senate. They'll probably get a regular gig on one of the cable channels, but sadly it looks like the spirit of Jeff Flake might be alive and well in the new U.S. Senate. This is courtesy of the Washington Post and courtesy of soon-to-be Utah Republican Senator Mitt Romney. The Trump presidency made a deep descent in December. The departures of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis and White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, the appointment of senior persons of lesser experience, the abandonment of allies who fight beside us, and the president's thoughtless claim that America has long been a sucker in world affairs all defined his presidency down. It is well known that Donald Trump was not my choice for the Republican presidential nomination. After he became the nominee, I hoped his campaign would refrain from resentment and name-calling. It did not. When he won the election, I hoped he would rise to the occasion. His early appointments of Rex Tillerson, Jeff Sessions, Nikki Haley, Gary Cohn, H.R. McMaster, Kelly, and Mattis were encouraging. But on balance, his conduct over the past 2 years, particularly his actions this month, is evidence that the president has not risen to the mantle of the office. He goes on to say, I will act as I would with any president, in or out of my party. I will support policies that I believe are in the best interest of the country and my state, and oppose those that are not. I do not intend to comment on every tweet or fault, thank you, but I will speak out against significant statements or actions that are divisive, racist, sexist, anti-immigrant, dishonest, or destructive to democratic institutions, unquote. Mitt Romney in the Washington Post. So, Jim, there's not a lot in there that he says that we would probably find a lot of fault in, but the fact that this is how he's starting his tenure, we kind of know all these character flaws in Trump. This guy spent his whole campaign explaining how he's going to work for all these different ways to cooperate with Trump, and then this is his eve of taking office. He drops this little ditty in the Washington Post.
Yeah, Greg, I really put this in a very strange category in which I pretty much agree with everything he wrote in that op-ed, and yet I still don't like it. So I don't know whether that's post-holiday hangover and crankiness, but just an observation that, first of all, I mean, look, we all know what Donald Trump's character is. I don't think there's any more. I don't think anyone had that many illusions about it in 2016. I don't think anyone should be all that surprised by what we've seen in his presidency. And I think you can very much make the argument with the departure of Mattis and a couple other decisions. Things may be getting worse, not better. But the problem is when you say this in the Washington Post, I mean, if you pick up any Washington Post on any given day during the Trump presidency, there's a good chance like 4 out of the 5 stories on the head front page will be some variation of Donald Trump stinks. Donald Trump stinks. Republicans stink. Brett Kavanaugh stinks. They're all the worst, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty much everything Trump opponents would want to see. So when you put it on the op-ed page there, Mitt Romney is speaking to people who pretty much already agree with him, except for the people who would say, sure, you say you're opposed to Trump's bad character, but there you are voting for his agenda. There really is no pleasing anyone in this environment, and there's a circumstance where someone's going to be calling Mitt Romney a sellout fairly quickly and say, oh, what was that tough Mitt Romney who was going to stand up to Trump in the op-ed the first time Mitt Romney votes for some nominee that the Democrats don't like. He's following up with an interview on CNN today. Again, nothing inherently wrong with that, but if he had done this on, say, the Wall Street Journal op-ed page and, say, done an interview on Fox News, he'd be at least taking his argument to the president's supporters and say, you know what, I know you voted for this guy. I know you want to support this guy, but he's got some serious problems. Here's what's wrong with him. Instead, he's preaching to the choir. We've been through this before. We've been through this with Flake, you mentioned, Arlen Specter, Charlie Crist. I mean, there's a long list of Republicans who have risen and they have a much higher profile by ripping other Republicans. Now, Probably Mitt Romney wanted to get this out, get over and done with, put it out there, lay down a marker. I think his general philosophy of saying, I will vote for the policies I think are good. I will vote against the policies that I think are bad. And when the president crosses a line, I'm going to call him out. Look, I don't disagree with any of that. I just think that he basically has set himself up to be seen as, there we go again. Here's another one of those Republicans who's bashing other Republicans. Again, I think it's better if you have a particular issue. Maybe the ultimate replacement of a defense secretary might be it. Maybe the hearings for the attorney general. Tie it to something. And I think you're on stronger ground here. Otherwise, people do it. And the other thing, which I wrote about this in the Morning Jolt today, Greg, we can denounce the character of Donald Trump until the cows come home, and we probably will. The bigger question is so there are a lot of Americans who weren't all that bothered by it. A lot of Americans who said that was acceptable both in the 2016 Republican presidential primary and the 2016 general election. We'll see how 2020 shakes out. But if you really think, how can Americans vote for this guy? How can Americans support this guy? Well, Trump is just a reflection of their values and their philosophy and what they think is important. And, as I wrote today, a lot of Republicans looked at how Bob Dole was treated, about how George W. Bush was treated, George H.W. Bush for that matter, McCain, Romney himself. I mean, ironically, the defeat of Romney is a very big factor in what led to the rise of Donald Trump, the perception that nice guys with good character finish last, or at least finish second. And the question is, would you rather have the jerk who is on your side and says he's going to defend you, or would you rather have the nice guy who can't get into office to defend your values? I suspect that's the calculation that a lot of evangelical conservatives made, and we can argue with it, but they've made it. And if they're wrong, you got to persuade them why it's wrong, not just denounce them. Because at that point, you kind of get there's a little bit of a whiff of deplorables coming off on this, and I think that that's not where Mitt Romney wants to go, particularly as he kicks off his Senate career.
No, and a couple of thoughts here. First of all, I think you summed it up perfectly. He was going to get a question about Trump probably about half an hour after he got sworn in on Thursday, and all he had to say was what you said. I'm going to vote with him when I agree with him. I'm going to vote against him when I disagree with him, and he crosses a line, I'm going to call him out on it. Instead, he has to take off this big op-ed in the Washington Post and basically stake the ground as the next Jeff Flake, which most people in the Republican Party, again, even if they agree with what he's saying, don't like the tactics. And secondly, this is the public persona of Mitt Romney going in, and he's replacing Orrin Hatch, who might be leaving the greatest press office Twitter feed on Capitol Hill.
Good point. Those are big shoes to fill, Senator-elect Romney. That's a little more wackiness, a little less high dudgeon and righteousness.
That's right. All right, let's move on to our second bad martini. And Jim, it is the season for all these Democrats to be announcing exploratory committees. It's going to be happening left and right. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Technically, Julian Castro, I think, was first, but nobody cared, or at least nobody paid attention. But technically, he's thinking about it. I'm sure he's going to run. And then on New Year's Eve, because the party wasn't big enough, Elizabeth Warren decided that she was going to get in with her cheery message of how the rich and the powerful are keeping everybody down.
I've spent my career getting to the bottom of why America's promise works for some families, but others who work just as hard slip through the cracks into disaster. And what I've found is terrifying. These aren't cracks that families are falling into. They're traps. America's middle class is under attack. How do we get here? Billionaires and big corporations decided they wanted more of the pie, and they enlisted politicians to cut them a fatter slice.
The only thing missing was the Bernie Sanders Brooklyn accent on billionaires there, Jim. But because she was convinced that people wanted even more of her after that introductory video, she decided to do Instagram Live, I think, again on Monday. And it was only about a 15-minute video, but she just on the spur of the moment had to get a refreshment.
Hold on a sec. I'm going to get me a beer.
So, Jim, Elizabeth Warren is basically following in Hillary Clinton's footsteps of trying to act like a normal person when clearly there's some issues there. If you can't get through a 15-minute Instagram video without getting a beer, it either means that it's contrived or you have a serious problem. So what do you make of it?
I don't – as far as we know, she's not an alcoholic and, nothing wrong with having a beer now. Say the two guys having a 3-martini lunch every day. We don't have to do. If you ever thought, boy, Greg and Jim can really hold their liquor, no, we don't actually drink during the program. Often. Well, at least on my part. So 2 thoughts on Elizabeth Warren. The first is the general reaction is I was struck by how muted and subdued the reaction was. And I don't know if it's because it happened on New Year's Eve day and people just were tuned out and not really paying attention to politics and not online, being healthy and having normal lives like they should. But there was a lot of sense of, this feels like Chris Christie. This feels like a candidate who had a really good window 4 years earlier and chose to do it 4 years later than they should have. They're not the fresh new thing anymore. It's going to be a crowded field. This kind of feels kind of tired. Obviously, she hurt herself with the DNA test and just kind of a sense of, oh yeah, Elizabeth Warren's running. When she really was the kind of person who was exciting Democrats, not just, I think 2016, but also I think remember 2012, she was the one who did the original, you didn't build that, spurring President Obama to make that kind of a comment. So the idea maybe she's past her prime, but I'm going to argue against myself for 1 second here, Greg. I'm going to observe it's possible if she were a stock, she'd be undervalued. Now, let's point out she probably would not like to be compared to a stock, considering her views on corporations and the stock market and all that kind of stuff. But the idea that here's everything she's saying there, and I'm working on a piece on her. Some really fascinating stuff. One of a big moment in her career was appearing on the Dr. Phil show. That she used to have much more of a background in kind of consumer finance, and this was part of what her early books were about and things like that. And the second thing that's kind of fascinating is, who used to love Elizabeth Warren back during the Bush years, Greg?
Is that?
Lou Dobbs. Lou Dobbs had him on her program a bunch and praised her books, praised her work in his book. And when she was oversight for what turned into the bailout, he was saying, I can't think of a better person to be chairing this panel. I mean, he was a fan. Now, of course, now he's saying, he's tweeting that she's a double agent for the Republicans and stuff like that. But so this is why you listen to this podcast. You get to hear about my articles before I finish writing them. There's some fascinating stuff in her background there. But this general sense of America, you're not in financial trouble because of your own bad decisions and spending habits. You're in financial trouble because of big banks and corporations and other people taking advantage of you. That is a seductive message. Now, I think there are some cases in which it is true. I think there are some cases in which it's not true. Just had this $550 million fine against Wells Fargo for opening up accounts in customers' name without their consent. There's indisputably bad behavior going on in corporate America that needs to be, that the law needs to come down on. And I think, there's traction for that, and maybe even a bipartisan interest in that sort of thing. Having said that, this is like the anti-personal responsibility message. None of this is your fault. It was totally good sense back in the Bush days to take out that second mortgage and to start flipping houses without any money down or any collateral or anything like that. At some point, what question are Americans responsible for their own financial situations? And her messaging is very heavily in the direction of they're not responsible. It's these big mean banks, big mean corporations. And there, remember Trump was trashing hedge fund guys and saying that they were undertaxed and stuff like that back on the campaign trail in 2016. So I would not totally dismiss Elizabeth Warren. I think I remember thinking back during 2016 that if Bernie Sanders, someday somebody was going to come along doing the Bernie Sanders shtick without looking and sounding like Bernie Sanders, she would be a very interesting measuring stick of how much appeal there is for this argument that none of your financial problems are your fault. It's all these big rich people who are to blame. I don't think class warfare has never really gone out of style, unfortunately, Greg.
Get ready for a lot of that with her and probably Bernie in the race. And, even Beto was talking about a lot of this stuff. So you're going to be hearing a lot of this rhetoric, especially over the next year when there's a dozen or two Democrats in this race. And really for the next 2 years, at least. So buckle up. Let's move on to our crazy martini now, Jim, because Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Biden, Beto, all these people might just want to think twice about even getting in this thing because someone else is getting in who might just dominate the field. This is from the Atlantic. What if a meteor were hurtling toward the Earth about to kill millions and reshape life on the planet as we know it? And what if the president, instead of doing anything to help, made it worse in just about every way and called it a hoax and any solutions a scam instead of the very real, very clear disaster taking shape? And what if all the Democrats running to beat him in the next election went on and on about how concerned they were and how it's our most pressing problem, but none had ever done much more than talk about the problem? And for the most part, only started doing that in just the past few years. That's where Jay Inslee thinks America is when it comes to climate change. And that's why he is going to run for president. The question is whether he can convince anyone else that he's a big enough player to be a serious candidate. For those who don't know, Jay Inslee is the Democratic governor of Washington, spent a couple decades in the House of Representatives or close to that. obviously a liberal. He's in his second term as Washington governor. Jim, he had been kind of on the, I don't even know if third tier might be too generous of speculation about who might run, but he's a single-issue candidate on climate change. Is there an avenue for him here?
I just want to point out when I sent out a message to some folks saying, "Hey, did you see Jay Inslee's running for president?" I'm like, didn't he used to kick for the Dolphins? Very different guy. Different guy. The reason I know Jay Inslee, Greg, besides, I have some vague familiarity with him, but back in 1998, to give you a perspective of both how old I am and how long Inslee's been in politics. 1998 midterms are coming along. I am a tadpole reporter at Congressional Quarterly. And all of us got assigned, challengers to members of Congress to write profiles on. And I wrote a short profile of Jay Inslee. And I believe, all of us wrote, 3 or 4 of them. And there were 4 or 5 reporters who were assigned this. And just for perspective, I'm 20, early 20-something. Let's see. Yeah, 23, 24, around there. We're all young folks. This is one of our first big assignments. And I believe out of 30 candidates we were all supposed to write about, the only one who got elected was Jay Inslee. So I was the only one who got a published piece out of it. Everyone else had these completed profiles are all ready to roll with these new members of Congress, but it didn't happen. So that's 1998 for perspective. So more than 20 years ago, Jay Inslee was first going to the House of Representatives. I think you summarize his perspective and his viewpoint. Yeah, this is a Washington State Democrat, far lefty, and he's talking about running almost entirely on climate change. Now, as I will have up in the corner in just a little bit later today, there's a part of me that says, Greg, you know what? Bring it on. We welcome this because here's the thing. My sense is that most Americans, if you ask them, are you worried about climate change? A lot of them will say, yeah. If you say, do you think it's happening? I think there's a Yale study which spurred that no dissenters allowed, Meet the Press edition, found 70% think it's happening. 62% think it's affecting the weather, but 57% think it's affected by human activities. But then that survey asked, do you think it will harm you personally? Only 41% said yes. That suggests to me, I don't think 59 people, Greg, think 59% of people think they're going to die off before it kicks in. I think most people don't really think it's going to affect them that badly. And I think this is going to be a very interesting test for the Green movement, for climate change advocates, to kind of say, okay, you guys say this is the single most important issue, not just facing the country, but humanity as a whole. Your guy's going out there. He's going to talk about it almost relentlessly, almost singular focus. It's almost a one-issue campaign. Good luck, guys. Let's see how that goes. My suspicion is it will not. My suspicion is it will not gain much traction, and that I got to write my profile of Jay Inslee, the second profile of Jay Inslee, fast, Greg, before he leaves the race, because you missed the window on some candidates. Tom Vilsack was out before I could get back in the United States back in 2007. Jay Inslee is, not a whirling dervish for all political charisma. He's going to have a tough time. I think this is an issue that most Americans are vaguely, sort of, kind of concerned about. But the problem seems far off. It doesn't seem as pressing as certain economic issues or terrorism or things like that. What Americans are willing to do about climate change is maybe buy stuff at the supermarket that's got a logo on it that says it's environmentally friendly. And then they can tell themselves, oh, okay, I did something to help the environment. So you ask people, do they support a carbon tax? Sure, because they think the other people, rich people and corporations, are going to pay the carbon tax. I'm trying to find it, but I'm pretty sure there's a poll that said, would you personally pay a carbon tax of $500 a year to help fight climate change? Then they said, how about $1,000 a year? And it dropped. And then $2,000 a year. Surprise, it dropped a lot. So people support carbon taxes as long as someone else is paying them. And I think Jay Inslee is going to, kind of smack right into that brick wall right there once he gets out on the campaign trail, finding out that Americans are worried about climate change, but they may or may not be all that interested in voting on that issue.
Wow. Yeah, the only time I ever ran into Jay Inslee was when I was a dugout reporter at the congressional baseball game. And, they say at the beginning of the new year, you should say some nice things about everybody. Good ball player.
All right, good for him. All right,
But here's what
we got: left winger and left-handed pitcher. Throws left, bats left, governs left.
Yes, exactly. But here's my question. There's one other guy who is thinking about running essentially on an environmental platform, and he's got money to burn. Tom Steyer. He's leading all the Trump impeachment things. So if he decides not to run and pours a ridiculous amount of money into Jay Inslee, could that change the game? Or do you think what you just said about Americans caring about the climate but not necessarily making it a top-tier issue for themselves will ultimately hold?
Again, it's very hard to picture Inslee coming out of nowhere. And I don't mean to say Washington State is nowhere. It's a beautiful state. I like it. Further good perspective on this. It didn't get a lot of attention. 2018 election day, Washington state voters went to the polls, and there was a referendum. It was going to charge oil companies and other significant polluters in the state $15 per ton of carbon released. It was going to increase by $2 a year every year until 2035. And look, it's Washington state, right? The environmentalists and flannel and Starbucks and constant rain in Seattle and, they wanted that crazy tax on Amazon. And it lost, Greg. It lost 56% to 43%. It wasn't even that close. So if you can't get a carbon tax enacted by referendum in Washington, I have a very tough time seeing you significant support building for it. One, both for the legislation and a presidential campaign that I assume would be heavily focused on supporting a carbon tax.
Yes, good point. That's a good way to look at it. Although, keep in mind, Washington does know that Die Hard is the best Christmas movie of all time, and now they've shot down this carbon tax. So things are looking up in Washington a little bit.
Look, I've always liked Washington. I'm glad it's a beautiful state. I can understand why it has, so many folks who identify as environmentalists. I do think, Greg, they do need to worry about the periodic problem of high school prom queens being found wrapped in plastic. It was a big issue back in 89, 90, and there was a recurrence of that in 2017. It's mostly small towns in Washington, though.
Oh, Jim, back in mid-season form. Happy New Year to you, and we'll do it again tomorrow.
Looking forward to it, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today, and tune in again on Thursday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.